very much. So had the presentation on Thursdays, kind of gave you a preview of what's coming today. In the agenda item, there are two documents, one of which is what we call the Strikethrough Draft. So it's actually the language of last year's legislative program marked up with new language, additions, subtractions, edits. So you can kind of see where everything fits within the program. And then what's projected, and what I'm going to talk through relatively quickly here, is we call this the changes table. And this goes position by position and tries to identify everything that's changed, even down to editorial changes that really don't change the subject of or the substance of a position. But we want to make sure that you're aware of all the kind of changes that happen in terms of this document as you're looking at it and deliberating it. So I will jump right in with language from your and the Board of Supervisors joint legislative priority position. I believe they're actually going to be talking about this tomorrow. Exactly the same language as you're seeing here today. The recommendations on this position really were to kind of recast the first couple of paragraphs of that position. It's traditionally focused almost entirely on funding, if not entirely on funding. The language changes that are recommended really focus in on the issue of required local match, particularly, and using the example of the salary increase that the General Assembly adopted last year and the challenges that we had as a locality in terms of coming up with a matching amount to be able to provide a salary increase. So there's a lot of new language highlighting that, and then a lot of new language highlighting the importance of the study that the General Assembly authorized from JLARC that's going to talk about education funding and adequacy and the standards of quality, and that's going to be an ongoing process. That doesn't even start, I don't think, until next summer, and then it'll be a 2-year study, so that'll be ongoing, but we want to make sure that we're still involved and that they're looking at the right issues when they're having their discussions. So I'm going to jump ahead to college and workforce readiness. The only real addition there is actually addition to an existing position, and that's just to clarify that in addition to wanting to increase the opportunities for students to have work-based learning opportunities, we also want to look at programs to address some of the barriers that students may have to those opportunities. Transportation is the first one that comes to mind. The fact that a lot of these opportunities are actually off-site, they're not on a school campus, and the student's ability to get to and from the work site is it can be a barrier to some. So let's see, under English language learners, item H, just wanted to make sure that you saw that you had one paragraph which essentially had two different ideas in it. And I just split that in two pieces so that people can see that one is about paying for assessments and one is about transferring assessments between school divisions, so that if we have an English language learner who transfers from school division to school division, their scores follow them. So it's easier for us to do placement and get them into the right programs. Another position that I wanted to highlight is the Freedom of Information Act. You have language in there right now that talks about setting open meeting thresholds as a percentage of board. That proposal was actually discussed by the General Assembly. It was sent to the Virginia FOIA Commission. It has not made it out of the Virginia FOIA Commission. So the change in language isn't to change the purpose of that position. It's to get away from the specific mechanism and to talk about providing more flexibility. There may be other ways to come at the issue, whether it's to limit it to boards of a certain size or something along those lines. But the advocacy stays. It's just the specific remedy that's being called for is taken out, and it's more of a general ask for flexibility. Item N, that's another one that it was a very dense, long paragraph. It had two separate ideas in it. So we went ahead and tried to re-edit it down so that it hit both the idea of making sure that the state is adequately funding programs addressing poverty and measuring poverty not just on a division-wide basis, but also on a more granular basis, whether that be school by school or student by student. And then the second part of that position talks about coordinated policies among all levels of government to address the root causes of poverty, because there's only so much that can be done within a school's walls. So wanted to make sure I highlighted that for you. Flipping over to the next page, item R, school construction. New language is being added here that kind of clarifies your proffer position and make sure that proffers actually accurately reflect and compensate for the cost of development on the school division, just to make sure that it's clear what the ask is for the proffers. Under special education, this is an issue that a number of you brought up and staff has brought up as well, is the need for initiatives to address chronic shortages of qualified special education teachers. There is some effort at the state level to do that right now, but those efforts, it's going to take a little bit of time for them to work through the process in the system. So I think it's important to have that highlighted as a critical need for the school division. Under the standards of accreditation and standards of learning position, the first item that's deleted, it was very, very specific to the virtual program that we had under COVID, so that's no longer relevant. The next position that we added language to talks about continued flexibility for graduating students, but this time it focuses in on the students who are in the graduating classes of 2022 to 2024. So it's very specific about the affected students and the need for ongoing flexibility for graduation requirements for the cohort of students, all the way from students who started as a freshman through ones that are already in their senior year. There's new language supporting additional flexibility in the administration of Virginia's new growth assessments. This is the system whereby they split up the SOLs and are now administering them at the beginning and end of year. And then next year it will be the beginning, the middle, and end of year. Some concern that the beginning of year test, at least so far, is not providing us with as actionable information as we had hoped it would, and that we may continue to do some of our in-house assessments, which kind of defeats the purpose of creating a growth model that reduces the amount of testing. So asking for more flexibility there. And then item T16, that was an issue that came up about unaccompanied minors who actually couldn't get their driver's license because they couldn't fulfill the parental involvement requirement under the driver's license code. So we got that adjusted so that there could be some flexibility for those students in that situation. Under standards of quality, and this actually goes part and parcel with the conversation about the new Virginia growth assessments, is advocacy for new positions supporting test coordinators in the standards of quality. So that would be state funding, essentially for something that we're already doing on the ground, but to get the state involved in providing some funding for those types of positions. Moving under student activities, this actually reflects some work that's being done by the Virginia High School League in terms of supporting standards to prevent bullying and discrimination during interscholastic activities. So this is the language that would support that effort that's happening at the VHSL level, and likely will be discussed at the General Assembly level as well. Under student health and wellness, two new pieces of information there. One is support for some sort of mechanism. It could be a standing committee or it could come in some other form to evaluate the impact of healthcare mandates on schools. Every year in the General Assembly, there are proposals to essentially require medical services in schools, whether it be for EpiPens, for asthma medication, for epilepsy. Those discussions, as you all are very well aware, when you have a medical discussion in the context of schools, it gets very complicated very quickly. And a single General Assembly session and typically just a couple of committee hearings are not sufficient to look through all the issues that come along with some of those discussions. So this is asking for something along the lines of the Virginia FOIA Commission, which takes some of these more complicated ideas, puts them in a group of experts, both medical and schools, and then brings back recommendations to the General Assembly for the following session. That would be the concept there. And then the other new language in that position deals with asking the state for some help with some operational and funding challenges with our food and nutrition programs, particularly due to the pandemic and the loss of food sales. but also some restrictions that the state has adopted in terms of being able to recoup some unpaid meals debts. That's created a gap in terms of our funding, and the state it would be helpful if the state could step in and provide some of that. Under student transportation, new language about addressing barriers to entry for school bus drivers, similar to the language that was there for special education teachers. Under teacher and instructional personnel, there's new language included supporting literacy instruction in Virginia's teacher preparation programs that's grounded in the science of reading. That will be complementary to some of the work that we're doing here in Fairfax, and will help to at least ensure that the pipeline of teachers, that as teachers are learning about literacy, that they're being grounded in the science of reading. So that is the state side. Now I'm going to change hats for a moment and talk a little bit about the federal legislative program, which is shorter but no less important, obviously. The changes that are there are only 4. One is to, in parallel with language that was in the state legislative program, to delete some very specific COVID/virtual program related advocacy. So that's no longer a relevant piece for you all. And then 3 new pieces of advocacy would be: 1 is support for federal funding for school infrastructure. And actually that language parallels exactly the language that you already have under your state legislative program. So that just brings that over to the federal side of the conversation. Next position is support for the continued enhanced reimbursement that we've been receiving from the United States Department of Agriculture for free meals for all students. My understanding is that now that we're back in session, those enhanced reimbursements have actually helped greatly in terms of the financial position of food and nutrition services, and it's something that I think we'd like to see continued in terms of access to meals for our students. And then finally, this is asking for renewed funding for, that was referred to as the Safer to Schools program. It's actually funding that expired, but provided some critical supports to localities for transportation safety, sidewalks, and making sure that kids can get bike safety programs and those types of things in terms of making sure that kids get to and from school safely. So that's what I have. Those are all the changes. You can see the detailed language in terms of how each one of those is translated into words in the larger document, but I wanted to make sure just to go through so you can have highlights of everything that we're proposing for change.
Right. Thank you very much. If you want to speak, put your placard up. We'll start with Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to Carl and Laura Jane, and Michael and Tammy for all of your hard work on this. It's greatly appreciated. I just have a couple of little nits that I think would be minor additions or changes. On page 1, on the joint legislative priority, shouldn't that say, where it says would have been 22.4 million while the local cost would have been 100.5? Shouldn't it say at a minimum? Because that was the low end, but if we had fully funded. And then if I go to page 6 on the discussion with English language learners, I think it would be helpful for us to put a cross-reference to T, because T is where we also address more of that. And then on page 8, we have under N1, it says, and formulas which more accurately reflect the impact of large numbers of students in poverty. It should say within a school division, regardless of the percentage of the division they represent, because that's what we're trying to get more granular to perhaps regions. Similarly with special education S, I do think it would be helpful to reference the section in the federal area and remind people at the state that it's really a federal program. I'm sorry. That's under S. And then on W, where we're talking about the VHSL, I would suggest that we also need to put in training as part of that description. And then I had under, when we get to the IDEA, I would actually say chronically underfunded IDEA, so people know that it has never been done. And that's it.
As I turn on my microphone after I say that.
I think for the most part, those are mostly just editorial changes that I think we can pretty easily accommodate. I definitely see your point with IDEA that it needs to be very clear that it has never been funded to that level, never even even half of that level. In terms of the joint position, I think what this was referring to was the full 5%. So it was this was the number that came from our budget office and from the counties in terms of the split of what the cost of a full 5% salary increase was. We'll go back and check to make sure that that's exactly what it is, and that it's, because the point was supposed to be that a full 5% was going to cost this much, and instead of a 65-35 split as you'd expect with our local composite index, it's much closer to an 80-18 split. For the various reasons that are cited after that point. But we'll make sure we get those numbers right.
I was under the impression that the high end was higher than 100 million.
All right. Ms. Cohen.
Thank you. I just had a few questions. Mr. Malloy, we had talked about the idea of putting some kind of language from a prior JLARC study that talked about service burden when we talked about LCI. I just didn't know if there was any thought given to that.
So for context, that was a recommendation that was made by the last JLARC study, which was actually in 2002, if you can believe it, on education funding. So we're 20 years since that point. And sadly, I can tell you I was there when it was done, so I have a little bit of direct knowledge. The concept of service burden was really to look at adding a factor into the local composite index itself that accounted for kind of the magnitude of whether it be special education students or English language learners or students in poverty. So students that in some cases require additional services and generate additional costs at the local level, to factor that into the local composite index. It's definitely something that we can mention by name. It's probably, as I said, it's a 2-decade-old concept. So we may want to refer to it a little bit in a little bit more generic a fashion. But it is certainly something that we can point out as another flaw of the local composite index, not measuring the burdens that are placed on particular jurisdictions based on the composition of their student population.
That would be great. Another question I had, the testing coordinator language, is there any thought to also putting it under T when we talk about our SOL language that's in there?
We could. We typically try to keep positions in one place and not to, it's a large document, so we try not to have redundancies of saying the same thing in 2 different places. I can look and see if there's a way that we can cross-reference. I know that Ms. Corbett-Sanders had mentioned a couple of those other possible cross-references, but I'll look and see if there's a way to do that without necessarily having to add the exact same language in both places, but I see your point with that.
Yeah, and my only worry is just when you think of if someone's going to just look at where do we stand with SOLs, I think just mentioning that burden has now placed an undue burden on our staff. I was also just going to ask you if you could give, I think many people were really surprised to hear that we were having 2 SOLs this year and then 3 the following year, when this board has always taken the position of trying to reduce some of the prescribed testing that was coming from the state. So I wondered if you might give us a little legislative history of how that happened.
So the state has measured growth for students very indirectly for the last number of years. There is a measure of growth that the state uses, but it's not a direct measure. It's kind of an imputed calculation of this is what last year's students look like, this is what this year's student looks like, and we'll kind of extrapolate what growth looks like. So there's always been a desire to create a system where you can more directly measure growth, which really requires kind of an initial test and a later test in order to look at the growth over time and kind of the effect that a school year has had on a student. The intention, I think, with this testing was to, one, take away the high stakes notion of the SOLs, was to kind of ramp that back in some ways. My understanding is that the tests are shorter. So it's in essence, it's not a longer test, it's just happening at 2 different times as opposed to all at the same time. Operationally, I don't know if that's exactly how it's come out. That's what the intention was, and that's what the discussion in the General Assembly was that this really wasn't supposed to, quote unquote, add to testing burden. It was supposed to take that testing burden and spread it out over a longer period of time and over a larger number of tests. As I said, operationally, I don't know if that's where we've landed, but that's kind of what the intention of the system was.
Ms. Derenak, Kofax has a rejoinder to that.
Yeah, Michael explained it quite well, but I just wanted to add, part of the advocacy because of this is with the one-time high stakes test, you, particularly in the elementary school years, you were getting children that came in like well below grade level, and say they were in 5th grade. This is particularly true of the newcomers. They would come in at a pre-K level, and they would get them up to 3rd grade, but that was never accounted for. And then a school was not accredited or accredited with warning. So that's the reason we really pushed for growth measures, to ensure that because we get kids at our door, many kids in some schools that do not come in at grade level, but for various reasons have to start at grade level and are tested. That was the real push behind that. So as Michael said, execution for what was the intent is not necessarily, and I still don't think I understand, but I'll ask that in my turn about the 3rd test next year. I don't understand that.
No, thank you, that's helpful. And I think just in terms of giving even extra support for the test coordinator language, the idea that any of our kids who are fortunate enough to have accommodations, the ball of wax that the number of admins and teachers that this all pulls into for small group and readers and all, so anyway, sorry, I know I'm preaching the choir, but it's just very frustrating. My last question was just more actually in Tammy's realm of the federal government, but do you have a sense is there conversation that's happening now about the USDA waiver for free lunches being continued ad infinitum?
I've heard peripherally that there has been conversation that they've found this to be an extraordinarily successful and useful program, and it's one that they've looked at. I think the question is going to be, frankly, funding, is whether or not they can afford to continue to provide those subsidies. And I think Dr. Brayman may have
I would just say, I was at our state legal conference, the Noel Ellerson with AASA. There is a lot of interest across the country to see the USDA programs from superintendents, varied states, varied sizes of districts, rural, suburban, urban. So I think there are some intensive discussions going on with the federal government. Nothing's been decided yet. But again, AASA, that represents superintendents, is pushing for continued support for this program that's really expanded meal access and has kept really, in some cases, some of our cafeterias from being segregated between those who go to the lunch line and those who bring. Because now what we're seeing, participation rates of all kids are up. So more kids are going through that lunch line, more kids are having the meal together. And I think it's a great win, but we don't know yet, but it is actively being discussed at the federal level.
So I guess my tie-in question to that then is, I know that we're talking about trying to get some offsets, hopefully from maybe state and / or federal government to help the money that we were making off of sales. But my understanding is also now this is taking a lot more personnel to be able to distribute these meals. So I guess just in those conversations, it's important for all of us when we are tapped by Tammy to go talk to our federal folks, that we also need to talk about implementation of that then looks very different than I think people think if they just automatically we're giving the same kids. It's not the same kids. It's an awful lot. My last question is just, I know we've gotten several comments from the special ed community in particular about some concern about now there's a noise as it counts down. This is like very intimidating. That they, oh my gosh.
Wow. We'll give you back 20 seconds.
Just that, I think they just like a little more clarification, and this may be better poised from Dr. Brabrand or Dr. Ivy, of just assurances when we talk about streamlining, making sure that access is easier for SPED teachers. I think there is always a concern that we're talking about lessening requirements. And so if somebody doesn't mind just speaking to that to assure folks.
Well, I can speak real quick from the state level. So you kind of have two parallel tracks, right, in terms of ensuring that the pipeline is adequate, but also ensuring that the quality is adequate. The General Assembly last year did adopt a number of new requirements that are going to come online in the next 18 months or so. I think some of them have already started, but some had delayed enactments. In terms of teacher quality for special education teachers and special education administrators. They had provisions that dealt with the kind of the pre-pipeline issues, so the teacher prep programs have some new requirements in terms of both teacher preparation and administrator preparation. And then there are going to be some new requirements that are going to be placed on all teachers, not just special education teachers, but all teachers, additional requirements for relicensure on some special education issues, and also some required training on the role of every participant in an IEP process. So there are going to be some new trainings coming online. So hopefully that helps on the quality side. It's the pipeline side that obviously needs. There are the critical shortages, which certainly are not unique to now. They're shortages that we've had for years, and it's something that we hope the state is going to continue to look at.
All right, Ms. McLaughlin?
Thank you. Michael, do you know where in basically our legislative package right now, in the past, I believe we finally added some language about religious exemptions, wanting to look into that. And so I just wanted to reiterate for my colleagues what I'd said on Thursday night, that this has gone on too long. The 2012 report from the Child Advocacy Clinic run out of UVA had identified back then that it was about 7,000 students a year getting religious exemptions. And their survey in which about 60% of Virginia school district superintendents responded back in 2012 indicated that school boards and school systems weren't even following the Virginia requirements, which is that just because a family files 1 year doesn't mean you aren't making them still file every year. You're supposed to be meeting with the kids to discern that it is their belief and not their parents' belief. I mean, there's so much layered in here. But my concern at this point is that we have an opportunity here to ensure every child. Back then, the estimate was about 500 kids in Fairfax County schools alone. It doubled from 2000 to 2012, and now we're at, another 9 years later, so the number could be even higher. But again, given we're the largest school division in the Commonwealth, I'm not sure that a lot of the other school divisions realize the significant number that this can affect kids. Again, this is nothing about parent rights, but this is about our constitutional duty to make sure every child receives an education. And given that we are the only state in the United States that does not have a homeschool requirement for religious exemptions, I think we're long past overdue. So I'm mostly using my time, Mr. Frisch, to sort of lay out the initial advocacy here that I would really like to see some support coming from our board. And would love to partner with anybody who's interested in this. And then certainly find some state senators, state delegates who will champion this. But I also am excited that Andrew Block, who was the UVA professor who authored this study back in 2012, under the McAuliffe administration, he ran the Department of Juvenile Justice, did major transformation there. He's now back at the law school at UVA, specifically with a new clinic to help law students do research and analysis for state, local officials on government policy. So I think we're also well primed that this is something he was passionate about. He's now back at the law school. We could even have law students that could also help us with this advocacy. So that's a key component of my concern. And then, as you also know, school nurses just continue to be a passion of mine. I would just say, Michael, that please let us know, what do you feel as our lobbyists down in Richmond that we need to continue to move in a positive direction for school nurses in our public schools, not just for Fairfax County, but around the Commonwealth?
So back to the first point is, just for reference, page 3, item B4. So it's under attendance and truancy. It's the last item there. And it basically just talks about the comparability of reporting between home instruction students and religious exemption students. And that's the advocacy that's been in place for a while. In terms of nurses, the General Assembly did last year pass legislation. They actually passed an addition to the standards of quality that required school divisions to have 3 what they referred to as specialized support positions per 1,000 students. And by specialized support, they actually included a few categories: school psychologists, school social workers, and nurses. That roughly works out, the 3 per 1,000 really roughly works out to 1 per 1,000 of each of those. So we did receive some additional funding from the state under the standards of quality for nurses, for nursing positions, which I think has translated into some additional positions that have been added at the county level, because we have the partnership with the county in terms of public health nurses. So the number of positions have been authorized. Now, obviously, in this environment, it might take them a while to fill those positions, but those positions are there and part of the county's long-term plan for nurses. So there has been movement there. I believe that the Virginia Board of Education, when they reiterated their support for the standards of quality and what they think the standards of quality should look like, is their initial proposal was actually for 4 positions per 1,000, not 3. 3 is what got funded in the General Assembly. They're continuing their advocacy for 4. That would require, obviously, school divisions, if they didn't have those positions, to add more. But that advocacy is ongoing for those specialized support positions at the state level.
Thank you. And if there's time, I'd like to go back.
Ms. Sizemore-Heiser?
Thank you. Well, I love that I have 23 minutes, but I don't need that long. So I could, but I'm kidding. So the first question I had is on this SOLs and the growth assessments. And, I appreciate really much Ms. Janet Koufax's sort of background around that piece. It was very helpful. And I think when I hear you say to get away from the high stakes, I think you said that, Mr. Malloy, that get away from high stakes testing. How does that get away from high stakes testing for students? Which one of those 2 or 3 counts for verified credits at high school?
So for a verified credit, it's passing the SOL, it's passing the final SOL. Okay. I think the concept was that would be a much shorter, less intense test than the current, or than since the previous SOLs was, because they were taking content from that test and moving it out. So the test itself would be less intense. Obviously, there would still be the need to pass that assessment in order to get the verified credit, but it was not supposed to be as intense and long and arduous a testing process for that one single test.
So are they taking what would have been in one SOL and doing it over 3, as opposed to,
in essence.
So it's not,
It's testing grade level material at multiple points during the school year.
I just think that perhaps as part of our advocacy is to make sure as they're doing this redesign, that they keep in mind that to remove the high stakes from both the schools and from the students, or at least address that issue.
So from the school's perspective, the picture I think is a little bit different because growth is part of the standard of accreditation. So growth can count towards a school's accreditation. It's not simply the passage of the assessments. So in some ways, they've alleviated the stress on the school side, and they've alleviated some stress on students, but there still is, kind of that fundamental piece that you're pointing out, which is the required passage of a test, even if it's shorter.
Yeah, I just had the concern because over the last several years, they've removed many of the alternatives to the SOL, the VMAS, the VGLA, those are all gone. So I have concerns when many of the assessments that our special education students used to access for verified credits are gone, and there isn't really much put in place. So that's where my advocacy comes from on that end. And I think that's important to point out to, I think, some of our state, when I mentioned it to some of our state legislatures, they're not aware of the history of what used to be available for our students and what is no longer available in terms of those alternate assessments. So I did have one other question, and Ms. Cohen brought it up when talking about the need for special education teachers and addressing that pipeline. Has there been conversations about potentially bonuses or differentiated pay or looking at compensation for sort of high needs positions or based on, maybe more hours needed as a way to address that pipeline at the state level?
So on November 1st, there should be an initial report that's provided by the Virginia Department of Education as part of that comprehensive legislation that dealt with special education issues
last
in the
summer, yeah.
JLARC study. They were required to come back with some options for how to address the pipeline issue. And some of the ideas in the legislation itself, some things that they were supposed to look at were pay-related. So differentiated pay, bonuses, all those kinds of things, signing bonuses. We'll see in the next week or so what the state comes back in terms of their advocacy for some of those pipeline issues. And that's supposed to be an ongoing conversation. It's not just a single report and then it's put off to the side. It's supposed to be an annual report in terms of kind of the initial ideas and then how effective the ideas are as they go forward. So there is some discussion at the state level on that.
Great. And then do you know, when you talk about the licensure, some of the new requirements for licensure, does that include for admins and gen ed teachers, sort of some basics on special education and special education law and that process?
In fact, it's almost specifically aimed at those teachers, is to give them some additional training. So it's not just special education teachers, it's all teachers are going to have to go through both the IEP training and also the new relicensure, requirements for relicensure and special education.
Okay, great. I just want to reiterate what Ms. Cohen said in terms of the flexibility for special education teacher licensure. We need to be careful that we're not advocating for reduced training. So we still have highly qualified special education teachers who we don't, I've been hearing some, concerns that there's a lot of training we have to provide because we're getting teachers who are, maybe didn't have as much training as they did before. And I want to make sure that we're being careful on that piece of it because it then just kind of comes down to us. And it affects the students. The other question I have is when I'm really glad to see the SOL and flexibility for graduation in here for the classes currently in high school. Is there anything similar that we've discussed about continued flexibility for students in postgraduate programs like Pulley, Step, and Davis? I know this year we were allowed to, I believe, that let them stay for one additional year. But for any students who are in those programs while during the 2020-2021 school year and weren't able to access job sites and things, I'm wondering if there's flexibility to allow them to have an extra year in those programs. I know IDEA, there is some flexibility, but there's a state code that requires only till age 21, and I'm wondering if there's room there. So just wanted to mention that. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that offline and kind of explain
Okay.
that.
All right, thank you. Ms. Tolan.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to just make a comment on, it's noted on page 8 under poverty and student achievement that we really are hoping the state will look at large numbers of students in poverty in the school district, regardless of the percentage of the division they represent. And that is a change that is in there. I wholeheartedly support this. And I noticed it kind of sprinkled a couple places through the document as it related, which I think is really good. So just want to put a plug in for that. If there's some way to support that further, just, let us know who we can work with on that. A couple of other things. Let's see, what did I have? Page 4. The whole section, of course, on work-based learning opportunities, same kind of comment. We have a number of organizations that have worked on this. Our JET goals have a workforce development section, as noted under number 10 here, careers related to environmental sustainability. The SCIPT group has a, workforce, portion also. So just trying to think of ways that we can get all these different people to coordinate to help move some of these things forward and maybe further define some of these barriers. I don't know, you've already mentioned the different studies and things that will outline more of what's in here. I don't know if there's any work to further outline the barriers for the workforce, work-based work.
The transportation example is the one that's been brought up to me more frequently than any other. I'm sure that there are others. I don't have any specifics kind of at my fingertips in terms of specifics. I think that the intent of the language in the legislative program is to be supportive of the initiatives, but not necessarily kind of dictate which particular initiative. That comes more on the advocacy side of the conversation of kind of picking and choosing among the ones that we think will be effective. So I think it's something that I can talk with our business partnerships staff and see if they have any very specific ideas for things that we can suggest to legislators as ways that might help to address some of these barriers.
And I know our CTE folks were a bit concerned because I believe our work-based development person is grant funded. So, we just want to make sure that we have the personnel to actually make these programs work. Let's see. Oh, on page 9, there was a mention, the second bullet down, number 4, that we support post-retirement employment options which do not adversely affect the employer, that encourage educational employees to work after they have accrued maximum retirement benefits. I would think, given our huge shortage of staff right now, that would be a big priority of ours, just looking at how can we encourage any of these people that are experienced and have the background to be working in our schools. So I think that's a big priority. And then on page 19, we talked about the under literacy, the pre-service teachers needing training. I mean, from our discussion the other day, it sounded like just making sure that our teachers that are currently working, that's a huge lift to give them the professional development as well. So I know in our 2x2, we talked a little bit about how could the state get involved in provision of some of that training across the state. And I'm out of time, so.
All right, thank you. Ms. Marin.
Thanks, Mr. Malloy. To follow on that, the question about the language for the literacy instruction, how was that language in AB developed? Just that one sentence.
So I think the intent here was last General Assembly session, there was legislation which kind of codified reading intervention services that were grounded in the science of reading. We've undertaken some work locally on that, and it's not just intervention services, it's the teaching of reading in general that really kind of relates back to being grounded in the science of reading. I think the intent with this language was when you start to talk about different requirements at different levels, you've got kind of the pre-service basket of candidates who are coming in. That's a different conversation than putting requirements on teachers who are already in the classroom, whether that be through licensure or whether that be through the provision of professional development. The state doesn't have an incredibly significant role in professional development. That's much more of a local locally based. The lever at the state level is more in terms of teacher licensure and then renewal of licensure. I think that language was kind of crafted being mindful of that balance that we talked about a little bit under special education of anytime you add a new requirement to a teacher, you improve their their knowledge, but that's an additional burden that's been placed on a teacher. And at the General Assembly in general, they are not, they're very good about adding requirements and they're very bad about removing requirements. So I know that a lot of feedback from our teacher organizations and just teachers in general is that every time they turn around, there's something new being put on them. There's nothing ever taken back off.
Yeah, well,
So I think that the idea here was to kind of come at it from that initial pipeline and then have the broader discussion about some of the other levels and some of the other things that can be done for in-service teachers.
Yeah, well, so just a few things. One is that I think this relates to number 5 in that provision AB, teachers and instructional personnel, which talks about the better alignment between content and coursework requirements and licensure. And I think what the language in number 10 has is really too weak. It's only talking about teacher preparation programs where the licensure is going to drive the preparation programs. I know in conversations with you, we had talked about the distinction of the prep programs, the licensure, and the PD. And so I do believe that the licensure is really critical. But what I want to share with my colleagues is that, you know, how open are we between now and when we approve this agenda if there are other things happening? You know, there's been a lot of excitement about this around the state, and if there is work brewing to bring forth something, I'm worried that this limits us if it's just about teacher programs. What if something comes up that is saying it's about licensure or even about professional development? So is it enough to have something as number 10 the way it is, and is this it? Or is it more effective to rework number 5 to include science of reading in that? Because I would hate to see us limiting ourselves to number 10, even though I know we can revise it, whatever, but there's a lot of energy. So that's a question that I would love to hear some input on, please. The other thing I wanted to mention was regarding FOIA. There's also lots afoot. Even today, I just got more updates about conversations. It turns out that just recently, several leading organizations in the state are on board to allow elective bodies to allow all public bodies to meet electronically for 25% of their meetings or 2, whichever is greater, and that would be adopted flexibility. That's supported by the Virginia Coalition for Open Government, VCOG, which is a very big watchdog group. So for them to be in support of that is a really big thing, as well as Virginia Municipal League and the Virginia Association of Counties, which our County Supervisor Jeff McKay is the chair. So that's also for me in that same bucket with the literacy instruction, which is there's lots floating around in the state, and can we be flexible to be responsive to this and support changes? So right now our agenda just talks about increasing the threshold for meetings, which I support, but there might be some other things coming forth. And so I'll do what I can to get that to you all before we approve, but you know, the process is the process. The last 2 things I'll quickly say is, I don't see anything in here about USDA food quality. While we're championing these food meals, the meals are not great. I'd love to see something in here in the federal agenda that talks about advocating for all the good things that we know need to be in food that currently are not. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Would you like to go, Tammy?
So just one
Go ahead.
One real quick piece. In terms of the FOIA conversation, you do have in your existing legislative program language that deals with, that asks for additional flexibility for electronic communication meetings. So that would, some of those issues that you were talking about would fall under that umbrella. So that's already covered. That's not something that you'd need to necessarily add any language to the program to be able to talk about. Mm-hmm.
All right, Ms. Darren Kofax.
I just wanted to thank you again, Michael, for giving us this in a way that's very easy to understand with the strike-through version with this page so we can follow through. I do really support and appreciate the changes in N under poverty. That is excellent way. This is something we have been working on quite a while, but this is a very succinct way of stating it. The rest of it is the talking point, so thank you so much for making that more succinct. You didn't hear my comment, Melanie, as I was talking under my mask. We said we need Michelle Obama back. That's what we need for these. But I would be happy to entertain some language in the federal portion about talking about that, I think, about food quality, because it has gone up and down during my tenure, and it was very up and good for a while, and I think it's the last administration kind of changed some things again, and so I think that would be something. I appreciate that comment. So that's all I have right now. I may have something for my colleagues in a little bit about school boards in general, but I'll reach out to you to talk about that later. So, and am I?
You're now in charge.
I'm now in charge. We now have 2 minutes, and
I'm going to go first. though.
oh, and you didn't go yet, so
Yeah.
please.
Oh, you've got
well,
your placard
no,
up. Now she
okay.
can go.
Go back, Carl. Ms. Keys Gamarra, followed by Carl, for 3 minutes each.
Yeah, I probably won't use it. Thank you, Mr. Malloy. I would like to point out just a couple of things, or maybe you can clarify for me. Under, I think it's special education, is talking about discipline, et cetera, and it would be nice if we made it clear, I think, that we actually may need more support with respect to being able to support our staff members in understanding communication to avoid discipline. As you know, our special education students often are disciplined at a higher rate. And I think sometimes that may be the result of the need for professional development. The other thing I wanted to mention, there's also something I think under English learners, which you may have mentioned, Ms. Derenak Kofax, in terms of needing additional staff and the intersectionality between that and academic achievement and that sort of thing. I'm sorry, let me go back to special education with respect to funding specifically for improving transition plans and making IEPs more friendly and accessible to families. There's never a time I don't hear parents complaining about that process. So I am just wondering if there is some funding that might help us to improve that process. And then finally, page on D, the last one, it talks about number 10, SCSB supports additional dual enrollment and work-based learning opportunities focused on careers related to environmental sustainability. I'm wondering why we would limit it to environmental sustainability. I certainly support that, but I think that we are encouraging kids to become excited about education wherever their passion is, and so I'd like to expand that if at all possible. And see, I didn't need the 3 minutes.
So on the last point that you made, actually, realistically, that language in 10, that was added last year as a standalone, but it really does relate back to that item under number 3, which is the more general advocacy for work-based learning and not kind of a subject-specific piece. That's certainly something that if it's the will of the board, we can kind of revert back to the original language under 3 and not have a standalone that's just isolated to one particular career cluster. But that is something that you all did talk about last year as something you wanted to add.
I appreciate it. I just want our kids to understand we're not saying you have to fit this category or that category. And if you get a kid to operate in their passion, then obviously we've done something good. So that's the purpose of that comment. Thank you. Oh, I also wanted to comment regarding Ms. McLaughlin's. I just looked up at her because she had her pink cup in her hand. Regarding how we handle folks who have, chosen not to attend our schools. I think we would need a lot of help from that resource you mentioned.
because the religious community is going to be in uproar. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who isn't, but I don't want this school system pitted against that community, right?
Well, just to be clear, though, it's not taking away their right. It's just holding them as accountable as all of our homeschool families. That's all it is. It doesn't take away their right.
I understand, having worked in that community in a different capacity. I would love to get the support of those experts at UVA to help craft language to perhaps avoid some problems. Sure. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and you guys maybe can talk offline. That would be great. Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Malloy, for all your work on this. A couple things. We added the environmental section last year, and one of the things that I've been looking at is a crosswalk now that the JET goals have been fully adopted by the board. I'd like to see, the JET recommendations specifically talk about joint advocacy between the Board of Supervisors and our school board around areas that the state and federal government can assist us in reaching our JET goals. So we'll want to do a little crosswalk on that to make sure that we include where appropriate. It's not everything, but the things that they can help with. Second, I did send you some language from Ms. Cohen and I around gun violence prevention, and that can either present itself as an amendment at a later date or be incorporated in an earlier draft. So that'll be something to talk about. And then on items in here, I too am eager to see us perhaps beef up and broaden out a little bit the subject of literacy in the program. It's unclear how it's going to present itself, and I would hate to have us hemmed into one particular path when we could be a value added to the conversation in a different direction. We have broadened statements throughout the program to give us that flexibility. I think we could do that here too, and include this as an example among others as well. And then, as Ms. Tolan said, safe routes to school, whether the state's going to help us keep that going or not, it's something that I would be very interested in pursuing as a budget item this year. So very, very eager to move forward in this work and grateful for all of the input from my colleagues.
Thank you. Now we will go to 2-minute go-backs, and we will start with Ms. McLaughlin.
First of all, with the open meetings laws and the numbers, I absolutely support that. I mean, the size of Fairfax County School Board at 12 is entirely different than the vast majority of school boards in Virginia that are 5 to 7. So I think we need that carve out. And then I did also want to just make sure again from what Ms. Keys-Gamarra said, because if we're not clear among the 12 of us, there's no way the rest of the public's going to be clear. We are the only state in the United States that doesn't require families who are asking for religious exemption to provide evidence that their children are being educated. It's just that simple. It's a constitutional requirement. There's probably federal law attached to it, but I'm not trying to take anything away from anyone. It's just all the other states say whether it's a religious exemption, and there's only 3 in the US that even give any religious exemption filing. Otherwise, it's just homeschool and that's it. You can fall under that category. Your kids are in school or you're asking them to be pulled out for homeschooling, and that covers all of it. So I'm glad Ms. Keys-Gamarra said something, because if any of you are thinking and concerned that this is about taking something away from religious families, it's absolutely not. But it is saying we cannot be the great commonwealth that we are and be the only one doing this where we don't ensure children have an education year in and year out. So that one's just weighing on my mind a great deal. And then for, the food component, again, I appreciate Tammy's joke and Melanie was saying, there's a lot that we also control here. And prior school board spent $150,000 on a study. So I think it's been a long time coming that maybe Dr. Brabrand, you can have your team provide us an update on where the needs are, where the challenges are, but we should not be finding out that because of our operational costs, that it is impacting the quality of food that we're serving children. And so we're going to need to know where things stand on that one. Oh, I'm done.
All right, Dr. Brabrand.
If I could just say, we'll be glad to get you an update on food. One thing that is going on, right, around quality of food is true supply chain issues with some of the food, high-quality food we want and we simply can't get. And I'll work to get you an update in a future Brabrand briefing. And I'll be glad to explain it and first provide an update and explanation to you all and then to them. But they're working very hard to deal with the supply chain issues that we're seeing. We're having to put some things like pizza on the menu more often because that's what we're able to get from the supplier. And I know you all and our families go to any grocery store, go trying to shop for the holidays. We're seeing it, and it's affecting food production just like it is some other things. But we'll get you an update, and I'll be sure to communicate to our families after giving you the update too.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Cohen.
Thanks. I'll just say on that point, I just wonder what the cost benefit is of giving children inadequate food versus, I mean, I don't want to say no food, but I know that pantries have come a long way during this pandemic. So I get your point, Ms. McLaughlin, and I'm eager for that aspect too. I did want to ask Mr. Malloy, I'm aware that in some of our special ed programs, that there's a large grade span of students who are allowed to be served. And from the limited research I've done on another state, New York, which has a very specific law about this, I think that we don't have any law about this. And I know that that's a really big challenge for our teachers and our students. So I just would like to know what others think about it and what could be done, and even just to start this process of trying to have these wide grade spans of students in single classrooms.
So I think at root, there's a question of whether or not it would require state action for something like that to happen, or whether that would be a local conversation, whether that's a staffing conversation that we could have here locally in terms of how we staff those programs. It wouldn't necessarily require state action. If state action were taken, it would probably come in the form of staffing standards. And as the joint position lays out, staffing standards have costs attached to them. And those costs do fall disproportionately on Fairfax as a locality because of a number of structural factors of the way the state's budget is put together. But that, I think, would be the next step beyond the local conversation, would be a statewide staffing standard conversation, which would have, and it would have a state impact as well. There would be a state cost, and that would be something that the General Assembly would have to deliberate.
Well, that's interesting to know that it could be a local approach that we take, so I'm really interested in discussing that at another time. The other piece is, we've heard statements like the state is flush with funding, they have so much revenue. What is realistic to expect when it comes to funding?
My crystal ball is extraordinarily cloudy. I apologize for that. I think you'll get a little bit of clarity in the next week or so, in terms of the direction that the state is going to head in. I think it's a re-benchmarking year, as I mentioned in the presentation on Thursday, and what that means is that the state goes through a process of re-updating all of its education funding formulas for new data. So they catch up for the past 2 years worth of data. So they update pupil counts, they update teacher salary information, they update all the input costs that go into education funding. That typically means more funding for school divisions. At their last meeting, the State Board of Education received a presentation that re-benchmarking right now would be about $353 million to fund across both years. That sounds like a large number, and realistically it is. However, it's much smaller than re-benchmarks have been in the past number of years. So that would be a much smaller amount of money coming into public education. Really, with re-benchmarking, the way to conceptualize it is that the state is catching up to costs we're already paying by updating those data, because it's not as though we we update our data every 2 years, is we pay whatever the prevailing cost is at the time. So our salaries go up and our costs go up. It takes the state a little while to catch up to those. So there is new money in the pipeline. Additional money beyond that, you've got the standards of quality recommendations that the state board has made. Most of them have to do with staffing standards. And then obviously you'll have the initiatives from the General Assembly members and the governor and whomever in terms of things that they may want to be interested in funding. So there will be new money in the pipeline. The question just is how much is going to end up in public education.
Okay, thank you. Can you remind me, when does the meals tax locally go in? Is that 23? 2023, that was approved on the ballot a
Yeah,
few
it's
years
either
ago?
2022 or 2023. It had to do with the date that the last referendum was held. And I just, off the top of my head, I don't remember if that was 22 or 23.
When you say go in, it's permission for us to relook at being able to enact the meals tax. It doesn't mean that the meals tax would actually go into effect. What the legislation, I believe, and Michael checked me on this, it didn't allow localities that had had a referendum on the meals tax to even consider a meals tax until 6 years after the referendum, or 5. I mean,
Yeah, that's what I'm not clear
and
on
the
either.
date's coming due that would allow us to revisit the issue of a meals tax. But we can get you an update on that
Yeah,
from Michael to find the exact year.
Okay. And the last, I think I just want to say to my colleagues is, I like the way that Mr. Frisch couched the language that we could put in about the science of reading, about not boxing ourselves in. And even again, Mr. Malloy, could that be more effectively just put into number 5 as it exists rather than creating a whole thing? But I just would like to understand where everyone's at with that one, because that was a really big priority for us. Thank you.
It's something that I will look at and see if where it makes sense to make a more general statement. If you want to go, if the board wants to go beyond just the teacher preparation program and just literacy training in general for teachers, it certainly could fit. I don't know off the top of my head if it fits in 5, because right now 5 isn't specific to any particular subject matter. And we could end up with another conversation like we just had with the standalone position that targets one particular subject matter and not others. But we'll look at a way to add that in that makes sense in terms of the board's priority and having that training.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Cohen. Thank you. I wanted to circle back to that crystal ball, if you would, and just ask you a little bit about like where our flexibility as a locality is. We're hearing a lot of things on the campaign trail about some things that we very specifically have worked really hard on. So principals mandatory reporting to police of any misdemeanors, which is something that this board and the previous board worked to make sure that our SR&R language reflected that we didn't want kids to have a criminal record for, stealing chalk from the chalkboard or whatever. And we're also hearing some about mandatory SROs in elementary schools and that funding will be withheld. And I've had several questions people ask me about mask mandates, what happens here locally. So I wondered if you, again, using your crystal ball, if you don't mind explaining a little bit for us and for the public, what's our flexibility here in Fairfax County when mandates like that come down from the state level?
Well, typically by definition, if a mandate comes down from the state level, there is no flexibility. It's something that we have to implement at the local level. I think what you're asking is what could happen to some mandates that are currently in place or some provisions that are currently in place, and it really depends on the provision. The one that you mentioned dealing with the reporting of crimes, that was a change in the Code of Virginia. In order to change that, the Code of Virginia would again have to change, which means that it would have to come through the General Assembly. The General Assembly would have to adopt it, and the governor would have to sign it. So a change like that requires legislative action. Mask mandates, it's a little murkier because right now there actually is code language that prohibits the wearing of masks in public. It actually was a criminal, more of a public safety / criminal section of the code. That section of the code has been overridden by language that's in the Appropriations Act. It depends on what the Appropriations Act says about that going forward. That, again, is something that would be amended by the General Assembly as they adopted the biennial budget over the next year. There are some areas where some of those mandates would actually come by executive action. It'd really depend on which mandate you were. We'd have to look at the exact mandate to see what the authority of the state was in terms of either implementing the mandate or allowing the flexibility, and what the authority either would be of the General Assembly or the executive branch to be able to either adopt or rescind some of those.
There's something like armed uniformed police officers in our elementary schools. Is that the kind of thing when you're referring to there are some things that potentially could be executive orders? Is that the kind of thing that you're referencing?
It's difficult to say one way or the other. Executive orders typically haven't been used that way. That typically has been more of a General Assembly / Code of Virginia action. But there's nothing saying that that's not something that could be discussed at a future date by a future executive if they so chose. But it's just, I'm sorry, I can't give you anything more definitive than that, but.
No, that's helpful. We've had a lot of questions in that vein, and it's helpful to get your take on what we could do as a locality. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention a couple things really quickly. First, I really appreciate the FOIA piece in here, and I just wanted to mention in doing a little research that 43 other states define open meeting as a majority. So, and I think only 3 other states have 3 or more as open meetings. So Virginia's pretty well out of the norm in terms of open meeting definitions. So I just think it's really important that we, emphasize kind of where we are in comparison to other states. I think Ms. McCarthy is going to talk to this too, but I do want to mention that when we look at workforce training, to make sure we include our special education students in that, especially having robust access to a variety of workforce training, even for the students who are still pursuing a standard diploma path, that they still have that access, because often it's a one or the other choice. And then, Ms. Merritt, I just wanted to, as you were talking about I'm really glad you brought the multi-grade classes. And just from my, I know you said you welcome your colleagues' comments, so I wanted to share my comments on that, is that in my, opinion, having, looked at special ed for a long time, it is a combination of how we staff special education and how we look at inclusion. We look at inclusion as being part of your neighborhood school, but not necessarily included in your general education classes. So because there's not usually the robust number of kids needing a certain service, but we still provide the services within self-contained classes, that they combine grades to have those self-contained classes in your neighborhood school. And if we looked at the studies, I could talk about this forever, around inclusive atmospheres for all students, if we actually staffed for inclusion, we could probably get rid of the multi-grade classes. That's my humble opinion on that. And I think those multi-grade classes are really detrimental because it's very hard for a teacher to teach, 1st through 4th grade curriculum, or sometimes 1st through 6th grade curriculum, and it makes it really hard for those students to access in elementary school any inclusive opportunities such as PE, music, arts, because it's hard for a teacher to provide supports in all different grade levels for those inclusive opportunities. So it's a really important piece, and I think there's room for us to look at it locally. I just wanted to share my thoughts since you invited it.
Thank you. Ms. Pekarsky?
Thank you. I haven't participated yet, but I agree with where the conversations have been going. And I think in general, this is, it has hit, I think, some of the things that we've brought up in our 2x2s. With regards to the science of reading, I'm open to how we include that, but I think we also need to be careful in that we are not somehow mandating on ourselves a particular way of, instruction. Not that we don't believe in it or agree with it, but just, things change as we learn, and just want to be careful with that. But we do want teachers who are, have the ability to teach reading, as those of us who actually went through teacher prep courses and effectively became teachers, had very, very, very little of that, reading teachers at that. So anyway, I'm open to the discussion, but as it is, I would be supportive as it is as well. What Ms. Sizemore-Heiser brought out, that I did want to see if there was room or a desire for discussion, where we talk about the workforce readiness. I think it's broad, I think it's good, but I wonder if we don't need something that is specifically geared towards our special ed populations, only because we know that that is a population of students in particular that is really, really has a high need for the extra supports, even if they are, as she said, still pursuing the diploma, because that could change at any point. So I welcome suggestions. I did want to throw it out there. It's something the two of us have talked offline about quite extensively, but I'll throw that out there if anybody wants to give any opinions or ideas around it.
So a real quick reaction is there's one of two ways you can go with that. One is you could add additional language to the special education position. The other is that you could take the language as it is here, and even the new language, and add something along the lines of, as well as initiatives to address barriers to accessing such opportunities for both general and special education students, to have that specific call out. That it's not just general education students that have these barriers. Obviously, the barriers are going to be different. I mean, they could be different for the two different populations, but that would just be a call out for the specifics within this position itself. But certainly open to language either way.
Okay, let me think about it. Maybe I'll talk offline. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser and I, like I said, have been talking about this. Maybe we can share with you, or maybe we'll do an amendment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Corbett Sanders.
I just wanted to follow up on that, because one of the challenges, and I actually think it may be a federal challenge versus a state challenge for special ed, is that our students age out at 22. And with COVID, the aging out at 22 has perhaps a more disproportionate impact on our special ed kids than just about anything else associated with the COVID situation. And so I'm wondering if we need to have some specific language in our legislative program that addresses that age piece. Yeah. But I think it's actually a federal law and not a state. Can I? Okay. And then the other piece is, that we've talked about the structured literacy piece, but there's a lot of concern and language floating around about the importance of having advanced math programming starting at a young age. And so maybe we want to add something in addition to our structured literacy, to ensure that there's robust math programming throughout the K-12 continuum. And that would be more along the lines of the SOQ.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett Sanders. Mr. Malloy, do you know the answer to that question?
About the special education students? So last year, the General Assembly did, they actually, it's not appropriate to call it flexibility. They mandated that school divisions provide an additional year for students, which was allowable under IDEA. And I believe that under IDEA, there is some flexibility all the way to age 26, and different states do it different ways. But there is, there's some degree of flexibility in terms of what individual schools and individual school divisions can do in terms of service provision. But that might be more of a local conversation as opposed to a state or federal conversation, just because there might not be the impediments to it. There may be other impediments, but there may not be legal impediments to actually going down that road.
Then I would encourage, if it's a local issue, that we bring it to a local discussion, because I think everybody around this table is passionate about making sure that we have those transition supports. And I would support my colleagues bringing that, or I will work with them. Thank you. Math piece, do you have anything?
I mean, certainly it would keep that from being a single issue advocacy. I mean, I know that literacy was something that was on the forefront of everyone's mind because there's been so much work done on it recently and so many changes on that particular topic. Literacy and mathematics, I think, are kind of go hand in hand at the state level in terms of the two critical areas where teacher training is required. So that could be, it's something that we could work in if that was the will of the board.
Thank you. I'm sure I'll be talking to some of my colleagues about that.
Does anyone else who hasn't had the go back or hasn't spoken at all have anything to say at this time? All right. Mr. Malloy, will you give us our calendar as to, so when we know we need to have these conversations and when our board is moving forward?
So actually, I need to look and see. This is on the calendar for final action, but I do not remember. It's one of the next two meetings? Is it the 22nd?
22nd.
Okay, so I can definitively say that this, that the final action on this will be taken on November 22nd. So that gives you some additional time to have conversations. If there are amendments that board members wish to bring to the legislative program, but that does give a few weeks to have a discussion about this. It will give me some time to draft up some of the changes that were recommended today. And obviously, based on next steps, you can give me some direction in terms of what specifically you want, what you want worked on, and what you want to added into the next iteration of this. The other piece that the board needs to look at is board priorities. That's kind of the companion document that comes along with this. It's not just, this is a big document. This has a lot of positions in it. Every year you all kind of distill that down to hopefully a single page worth of, here are the most important things that we have on our agenda this year. So that's something that you'll need to be talking about between now and November 22nd as well.
Thank you. I would like to adjourn, but it looks like I have two colleagues that you would like to speak one more time, and I have 1 minute.
Well, then I'm going to use my 1 minute to say I think this is shameful. We are scheduled to go for 2 hours. We are talking about our annual legislative agenda. If in the 2 minutes and the 3 minutes, board members have certainly more things they want to talk about. Karen Corbett-Sanders and I want to talk about everything that happened with the math curriculum proposal coming out of the Secretary of Ed. How do we protect robust math instruction? Like, this isn't a race to the clock, you guys. I totally get if it was 7 o'clock, shut it down, but to be told I've got a minute to talk about one more thing because we're going to be done now in an hour and 25 minutes on something we do once a year, I would ask that instead, why aren't we just seeing if anybody wants to talk about any other parts of this thing?
I did ask that.
But I got told I get a minute. Like, what am I going to say in a minute? Oh, I got a minute. That wasn't what I wanted to talk about. I'm just very disappointed and frustrated. Well, then put your sign up and get a minute, because that's all we're being given.
Okay. Let's,
Said, I'm giving you a minute. That's
because,
what she said. I told her.
This is far more productive than anything else we could do. So I think it is perfectly reasonable to say that people would like more time. I would say it's not reasonable to impugn the motivations of 12 other people sitting at the table.
I was not impugning the motivations of people that, no,
I don't think anybody at the table cared about higher-level math.
no, Ms. Dearnach-Kofax said, I asked if anybody has
Point of
anything else
order.
they want to talk about, and she said there's nobody else who wants to talk.
because I did ask that, Ms. McLaughlin. I did ask that. All right. This board, we have the opportunity, if anyone wants to go till 7, if you want to speak more, You will be given 2 minutes, because that's what we do, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, that's what we typically do. We will give you, if you're okay, Mr. Frisch, as my co-meeting manager, to offer 2 more minutes to anybody else who needs to speak. I did ask this before, and I didn't hear anyone respond. So now I have 3 people, and we will end promptly at 7. We will do 2 minutes, with the exception of Ms. Omesh, who you have not spoken yet, so we will give you your time.
And I will then get 1 extra minute.
You will.
Thank you.
Ms. Omesh, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the team for the hard work that's been put into coming to this place. Obviously, there are a number of pieces here that I would like to see reflected. I know I shared some of that in the public meeting. I'm not quite sure how to proceed other than perhaps through an amendment when this comes forward to suggest some of those. But, you know, student supports for student mental health, for example, whether that's staff ratios, et cetera, language access. And when I say that, I specifically mean things like translation. At what point is that required? Additional supports. I mean, someone alluded to math instruction, but even more broadly, just direct instruction in the post-pandemic year, what that looks like. In addition to requesting additional support for students in poverty specifically. And then, you know, some of that low-hanging fruit like recognitions and observances that could be recognized on the state level and streamline those pieces rather than have them be local controversies. So those are just some of the thoughts on the top of my mind as to things that we could add to this that are incredibly important, especially post-pandemic. I know that despite our best efforts, we still haven't found a time for me to meet with folks, so I don't know how to proceed from here when this is supposed to reflect the full board's consensus. So I'm looking forward to that, but I don't know if there's any guidance otherwise here as to how this is reflective or what additional conversations we can have in advance of finalizing this if not everyone's input has been put into it.
I think where we left off was encouraging you to set up a meeting directly with Michael so that we quit going around and around with unable to schedule.
Right, as of Thursday night, to have a meeting over the weekend when I was on a flight. So yeah, no,
I apologize. Everybody else seemed to be able to pull it off.
Yeah, I mean, I shared with you all that I need some more advance notice to schedule. I can't do same day, same week kind of stuff. So, but the point of this is not to say that, you know, I mean, obviously I'm disappointed. That's not the point. The point is to say, I don't know how we proceed without everyone's input in advance of these conversations. This is supposed to be reflective of 12 people's input.
So one thing I might be able to say that's helpful is that some of the issues you brought up, student poverty and funding for student poverty, funding for student mental health, those are already covered by language in the legislative program. So there are already kind of standing positions that deal with some of those issues. If they're not sufficient, that you and I should talk and see if there's additional language that we want to add. But and I always try to remind everybody every year that we talk about these issues here, but we're only talking about a very small subset of what the legislative program actually covers. Legislative program already covers a lot of those topics, whether it's been added in the last couple of years or it's a standing position that's been there for literally decades in some cases. So some of those issues I think that you brought up are already covered in some way by the legislative program. They're certainly not being neglected by this board or by this program. In terms of religious observances, I'm sure you're aware that the state actually did have a task force that looked at religious observances and kind of best practices. Their recommendations were really more on process, less so on specific holidays or specific practices. It was more on the process that localities used in terms of determining what the appropriate holidays were to reflect in terms of the student calendar. It didn't really have specific prescriptions in terms of what to do as opposed to kind of the how to do it side of it. So I don't know if there will be legislation that comes forward in the General Assembly. There may very well be, but that was the recommendation that was made by that state panel, was more on the process side of it. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew that some of those topics that you were talking about, they are in the program somewhere in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think I was hopeful that we might be a little more explicit given the situation of students, especially when it came to mental health. I think there's broad consensus that that's a severe need in this time. So perhaps we can explore that further. And with observances, I mean even more broadly, whether it's Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, you have counties across the state doing different things. And so that's just another example, but. Thank you.
All right. So, Ms. Omesh, will you be able to schedule with Michael to get more of your concerns, to have the one-on-one?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly want to. I don't think it's fair to bring something forward and say it's reflective of everyone when it's not. And look, I understand that, folks have a lot more flexibility in their lives than perhaps I do. I'm obviously a full-time student, So I just, I want to.
I'm sorry, hang on a second. Let's not everybody speak at once. I think this is a side conversation that can be had afterwards. But I will say that many of us have full-time jobs. Some of us have more than one full-time job. And it was not a matter of a day or a week. The first 2x2s happened more than 2 weeks ago. So we'll leave it at that. We suggested days ago.
I shared with you that I was asked to be available days after the first contact that was made with me. I'm not trying to make anyone look bad here, but what I want to make sure is the case is that my additions are reflected in the broader program.
All right, well,
That's all.
Let's have that side conversation then, thank you. Let's see, for the next 2 minutes, who do I have? Ms. Corbett Sanders, I believe you were next.
Thank you, and I will not take the full 2 minutes. I just want to let all of my colleagues know that I will be reaching out to you about an amendment to the legislative program to address the math and the provision of advanced math in the K through 12 continuum, so that we can ensure that we meet the needs of all of our students. And so, I will be talking to each of you. I know that my colleagues to the left and to the right are both passionate about this issue as well. So I hope you will be able to support us. And I'm not quite sure who will be bringing the amendment forward, but it is one that I feel very strongly about. I have advocated for advanced math in elementary school since my children were in elementary school.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett Sanders. I'll just tell you that I'd be happy to work with you on that. Ms. Sizemore Heiser.
Thank you, and I appreciate that because I also very strongly believe in having advanced math and advanced curriculum for all of our students as well. So I'd be happy to sort of talk to you about that offline as well. And I want to just apologize for jumping up and down, wanting to share my information about IDEA versus, I did a ton of research and met with a ton of people last year on this issue and actually talked to some of our state delegation about that extra year that they mandated. So that was something I worked on pretty strongly last year, and I just wanted to share my knowledge. It is something that can be done, from my understanding, at the state level. IDEA is about IDEA funding, but the state can mandate allowing for greater flexibility beyond that. There is a state code, from my understanding, that does limit us to 22, so it does have to come from the state. I don't believe we can do it locally. That's from my research last year. And I would be happy, Ms. Corbett Sanders, to work with you on that. That's what I was mentioning with the Davis Pulley STEP programs and greater flexibility for anybody who was in those programs during 2020, 2021. It's similar to what we're trying to advocate for with SOL and graduation flexibility. Same thing for students who had a virtual year of that. So I'd be happy to work with you, and I appreciate your work, and anyone else who's interested in hearing more about some of the research I did last year and really trying to ask our state delegation to give some grace and flexibility to those students who lost that workplace learning time. So I just apologize for jumping up and wanting to jump in, but I just wanted to share that information with you all. And Mr. Malloy, I'll follow up with Ms. Pekarsky on that, but I just wanted to share that with you and apologize for jumping out of turn. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Tolan. No, I'm sorry, Ms. Cohen, and then Ms. Tolan.
No, mine's not particularly helpful to this conversation. I am frustrated. I will just say that I do feel like when we say things like that, we also have to be careful that we have other folks involved. So my frustration is just on behalf of two extremely hardworking EAAs who worked really hard with everybody else's to get these meetings scheduled. So you were first contacted on the 27th of September. So I just feel like I don't like the idea that people were intentionally exclusive. Everybody's busy. Everybody's doing their best. I certainly support any additions that we would want to make to the legislative program to talk about flexibility around any kind of religious holidays. I certainly understand that advocacy. And I think, Ms. Omesh, if there's specific language when you look through the program that you're interested in adding where you feel like it's not addressed on mental health, certainly I think that's a conversation that we all would be very willing to have.
Poland?
Thank you. We all have different ways of doing our work, so I must admit, if one of my colleagues has done a really good job of covering a topic, I don't bring it up, even though I may, fully agree. And given that, I'm very happy to work with you on the math. The Cooper Middle School math teachers were very gracious and spent 5 hours with me on Friday to let me rotate through all of their various math classes and have conversations with them about this very topic. So I wanted the on-the-ground research to back up, any of my ideas. So happy to work on that. Mr. Frisch, we're very happy to work with you on that jet crosswalk in budget and on the legislative agenda. And also wanted to reiterate again that the Safe Routes to School position, I think, especially given our transportation issues that we're having right now, that we're seeing with COVID and our shortage of bus drivers, makes that position even more important. So hopefully we can make that case at the federal level. And I fully support the test coordinator. That position I think is super important. I've been in too many schools where the principal is spending their day coordinating tests, and that's not really appropriate, given everything that we have going on. So anyway, just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McLaughlin?
So Dr. Bray-Brown, when it comes to the advanced math concerns that some of us are talking about here and what we want to be more explicit, given what occurred at the state level, can you brief us on anything that your team has heard? Because we had Fairfax County math educators involved in that task force, and the board knew almost nothing about it. So where do we stand on the state and the State Board of Education wanting to take action on the advanced math coursework availability?
Well, I'd have to get some additional detail on that. I think the state superintendent was clear that advanced math isn't going away in Virginia when this issue came up. I don't have anything else. We haven't had any additional updates from the state superintendent since that issue came up months and months ago. We have, as you know, a significant amount of advanced math at every level, including at elementary level, and I'll see if there's any additional updates for the state, from the state, and we'll provide it to the board in one of my next briefings. Thanks.
I appreciate that because, I do know that when you say it's not going away, the task force was talking about that they would curtail availability until they got to the 11th grade. It is what the state of California ended up bringing and doing, and I don't want to see Virginia go that way. So that's why I feel really strongly that we've got to stay on top of it as the largest schools division. So, and again, did not mean to upset the apple cart with everybody here. I did feel like an hour and 25 minutes was not enough. So thank you.
Anyone else who hasn't had their second 2 minutes wants to do it, wants to talk? Abrar, is your placard up, or do you want to speak again? No, I didn't think so. Okay. Oh, you do? Okay, Ms. Marin.
I'll just say, I think this is a really exciting endeavor that we undertake each year, and I think, the updates that we've made reflect really urgent matters that we've even just recently talked about at work sessions. So I'm really pleased to see that we're trying to move the bar at both levels, right here and then at the state to help us here and then help the rest of the state too. So I think this is, I like to be able to point to what we're doing well and how we can work well together to do that. And I'm really excited to maybe even go in person to Richmond this year to advocate for these things. So thank you to Mr. Frisch and Mr. Annette Kofax and Mr. Malloy for helping, and Ms. Cohen, and everyone then, for helping to organize this tonight. Thank you.
Absolutely. The more people that can go to Richmond, the better. And there's also a federal legislative conference that people may be interested in. I'll get our board clerks to send that out to you. It is federal only and not state, but it is an interesting conference to attend, and I've attended it several times. So, Mr. Malloy, my colleagues, thank you for your time this evening. I appreciate it. There'll be many conversations on the side, and we'll please, and then we'll make sure you either get me involved or Laura Jane or Carl to ensure that Mr. Malloy is hearing all these things if we come to consensus on things that are not before us today. All right. Thank you all and have a good evening.